couple of days ago, James Woolsey, who was former head of the CIA under Clinton and apparently is going to get a position in the new administration, he gave a speech where I'm going to be tomorrow, in Los Angeles, where he informed the crowd cheerfully that we're now in the midst of World War IV. There's World War I, World War II, Cold War was World War III, now we're in World War IV, and we got to go over the countries that have been attacking us. He named two. He said Iran and Syria. Fascist regimes of Iran and Syria have been attacking us, and we finally realized it. So now we have to go after them. So maybe they'll be the next ones. Or another possibility is the Andean region, which is now surrounded by U.S. military bases, plenty of soldiers there, and it's a big energy-producing and other resource-producing region, and it's kind of out of control. So that's a possible target. And you can think of others. But you can be pretty confident that one or another is going to come along. There's no other way to continue with the strategy that's announced and they intend to implement. Remember, these are people who barely hold political power by a hair, and the only way they can hold on to it is by terrifying the population. That means there are things that can be done. People don't have to be terrified by imaginary demons. That's an educational and organizational task, one that's not easy, but certainly within the means of people who are concerned. Well, let's go back to last September. Right after it comes October, Congress declares that Saddam Hussein is a threat to our existence, like Nicaragua, and authorizes the government to use force. Something else happened in October, something extremely important. There was a retrospective meeting in Havana, 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who attended were key participants in the October 1962 missile crisis from Russia, the United States, and Cuba. And there was a discovery that actually shattered them there. It turned out that the world they knew it was a very dangerous moment. Arthur Schlesinger described it as the most dangerous moment in history, which isn't an exaggeration. But they found out last October just how dangerous it was. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from probably terminal nuclear war. It turns out that Russian submarines were under attack by U.S. destroyers. They had nuclear-armed missiles. Two of the commanders assumed that there was a global war going on and called for the missiles to be sent off. If that had happened, there would have been a massive response by the United States, wiped out half of Russia. They would have responded out and wiped out the rest of us, and we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But why didn't it happen? One submarine commander countermanded the order. The Russian rules required 3 commanders to authorize nuclear weapons. 2 agreed and 1 refused. That's why we're here. That's how close it was. This is after a campaign of international terrorism that led to the crisis, aimed at regime change for the kind of reasons I mentioned, all very much in the news last October, very imminent, barely reported. I don't know how many of you know about it. It was barely mentioned. Who cares if the world was one word away from nuclear war after a U.S. campaign of international terrorism? What followed was an increase in the terrorism and Dean Acheson's explanation, which I already read to you. Well, there are more important things than survival, like profits and power. That's what we learn from this. Immediately after this discovery, barely reported, a week later, October 23rd, there was a meeting of the United Nations Disarmament Commission, that's essentially the General Assembly. They passed 2 extremely important resolutions. One of them reaffirmed a 1925 treaty that bans biological weapons. The second was a resolution that extended a 1967 treaty banning the use of banning the militarization of space, preserving space for peaceful uses. Well, why those weren't reported, those resolutions? Had a friend do a database check. Weren't reported. Why? The United States voted against them alone. The United States and reflexively Israel voted against reaffirming a 1925 ban on biological weapons and a 1967 treaty, now extended, to ban militarization of space. Well, that's really dangerous, both of them, and very urgent. Shortly after, but not reported. Right after that, the U.S., the Bush administration killed a bioweapons treaty that was under negotiation, stunning the Europeans. Last minute, the U.S. stepped in and says, no, we're not going to allow any discussion of enforcement mechanisms for years. The reason, got to protect the secrets of U.S. pharmaceutical corporations. It's much more important than banning biological weapons. Probably there's another reason. It's very likely that the United States is carrying out illegal tests of development of biological weapons. A lot of scientists guess that that's the reason why they claim that they haven't been able to find the source of the anthrax attack. It was traced back to a U.S. federal laboratory, remember. This is not like disarming Iraq. It's a U.S. federal laboratory. They claim not to be able to find the source. It's kind of hard to believe. But it may be, and it's been speculated by the Federation of American Scientists and others, that probable reason is that they're concealing some kind of weapons development program that they don't want exposed. Well, maybe not. We ought to find out about it. Right after that, the U.S. went on to infuriate even its closest allies in the World Trade Organization. First of all, by taking a very extreme stand violating trade rules. Notice that that's another reiteration that's still following the script of the Reagan years. There's a lot of talk about free trade, but they were the strongest opponents of free trade in the industrial world. In fact, the Reagan administration was the most protectionist government in post-war U.S. history. They virtually doubled protectionist barriers in the United States. The GATT, which is the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, according to their analysis, Reaganite protectionist measures were 3 times as high as other industrial countries. Very damaging to world trade, but the most powerful state in the world does what it wants, and they're doing it right again. The Bush administration has broken some new barriers and protectionist measures, but much worse than that, and this really did amaze and infuriate Europe and others, is just a couple of weeks ago the U.S. intervened to prevent efforts which had been agreed to by the other industrial powers, efforts to provide inexpensive drugs to people who are dying of treatable diseases, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and others. That's tens of millions of people who are dying from these diseases, and the U.S. intervened to prevent access to inexpensive drugs, again, because huge profits for heavily subsidized U.S. pharmaceutical corporations are a much higher priority. It doesn't make you popular. The U.S. also continued to and is continuing to undermine international efforts to reduce threats to the environment, which are by now universally recognized to be severe and maybe a threat to survival. The pretext for this barely conceal service to pretty narrow sectors of private power. If you take a look at the journal Science, the journal of the American Association for Advancement of Science, the lead editorial about a week ago was a bitter condemnation of the Bush administration, the climate change science plan, which does absolutely nothing. It does nothing to stop what just about every scientist who pays attention recognizes to be a very severe threat. Well, again, profits are more important. All of this engenders fear and hatred of the leadership, and maybe ultimately hatred of the society, which was regarded as just too dangerous. That's going to lead to efforts at deterrence. How do you deter a country which has overwhelming military power? Well, every international affairs specialist can tell you, and does tell you, by proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and proliferation of terror. That's what the Bush administration is going to achieve. As I say, Osama bin Laden must be cheering somewhere. Well, you go back to that intelligent Martian. If he has some concern for the human species, he might be watching all of this with some amazement and asking how long it can be that people who live in a free country are going to allow it to go on. Thanks. I'm told that there are a couple of mics around, so if you'd like to go to them and we can turn this into a discussion. You start? Okay.
Hi, Noam. I wanted to ask about if we accept, and as I think we should, this sort of call to action as privileged citizens, what your estimation would be of two possible actions we can work for within the kind of narrow political spectrum. You've talked tonight about what was done by this administration and by some of the same people during Reagan Bush, and you've also criticized Clinton, but not so much tonight. And I'm wondering how important it would be to try to work for the change from the Republicans to the Democrats in the next election, which is, it's a measurable change, versus other possible political activities like, campaign finance reform and that kind of thing.
Well, it depends what the Democrats are. So I didn't talk much. I actually did talk about Clinton. So the sanctions that have destroyed Iraq and strengthened Saddam Hussein and made the population dependent on him and prevented an internal revolt, that's Clinton.
Right.
Okay, and there's plenty more. Take another example, which is often another domain. Take a look at Brazil. It's very interesting. It's informative what's happening there. Very informative. Brazil has a huge popular movement, left popular movement, nothing like here. They succeed, and they're very effective. The Landless Workers Movement, the Workers' Party, and others, the biggest popular movements in the world and the most effective. They managed to elect their own president. Pretty impressive guy. Just take a look at what's happening and think a little about history. There's a good reason why nobody studies history. It just teaches you too much. But take a look at recent history. 40 years ago, Brazil had a populist president. It was during the Kennedy administration, not like Lula, but, mildly populist president. Kennedy administration didn't like him. They organized a military coup to overthrow him. It happened to take place shortly after the assassination, but it had already been prepared by the Kennedy administration. It was hailed by Kennedy's ambassador as the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, while the generals were torturing and murdering. It imposed the first kind of neo-Nazi national security state in Latin America. That's the beginning of a plague that spread right through the hemisphere, ended up in Central America in the 80s. It's pretty awful. We ought to know all about it. This time, they're not calling for a military coup, although Lula's a much more threatening leader for them and has a mass popular support, organized support that Goulart back in those days didn't have. How come? Well, there's two basic reasons. For one thing, the activism of the last 40 years has changed this country as well as Brazil. People here wouldn't accept it anymore. Then nobody cared. Nobody knew, paying attention. But a lot has been done in the last 40 years. It's a much more civilized country. It'd be very hard to carry that off now. There's a second reason, and here comes Clinton. They don't need it. Back in the 1960s, the only way you could prevent a populist movement was a military coup. Now you can do it by